One of the most important safety rules is to never talk to strangers and do not trust them. This is more than true, but statistically speaking, the greatest danger can come from people you know. Today we tell the story of one of the most brutal murderers in the United States, who literally reduced an entire family to rubble. Amanda Louise Pruitt Doss was born in 1976 in Muskogee, Oklahoma, USA. It is a small town typical for this region. It is quiet and not characterized by any special attractions. The crime rate here is minimal, and the majority of the population consists of married couples with children. However, Amanda Doss did not like this area, and so she moved to another place at a young age. She settled in Redwater, Texas. Here, she found herself in a suburb with about 800 inhabitants. During this time, Amanda tried to build a relationship with the man she married. From this marriage, Amanda's first child was born, a girl named Genevieve, born in August 1999. The family called the girl General, and she was a wonderful child with a calm character. Jen grew up a little and became an activist and a Girl Scout when she attended Redwater High School. She was considered caring and responsible, which was evident in everything she did. Jen was completely selfless and once donated all the money and toys she received for Christmas to a children's home. That was when she was 9 years old, and it happened again on her next birthday. 4 years after the birth of her first child, Amanda had a second child, a boy named Texas, born in May 2003. The child was very similar to his sister, also loving to help others, and he became a scout as soon as he attended Redwater High School. The children were very close and friendly to each other. For all the neighbors, Amanda's family was the model of an American couple with children. Unfortunately, the couple divorced a few years before the events described, and the children now lived with their mother. She tried to provide them with an education and everything they needed for life. Working hard. During these moments, the woman was supported by a nanny, 16-year-old Rachel, who got along well with the children. Despite the apparent idyll, a grim fate was looming for these lovely people. May 11, 2011, was an ordinary day for the family. At this point, the 34-year-old woman was divorced and lived with her children in a cozy house in a quiet suburb. It was expected that they would have dinner and watch TV before going to bed that evening. Everything went as usual in complete silence. After spending time together, the children went to their beds. But at 3 a.m., their peace was disturbed. At this time, Amanda's parents received a frightening call from their granddaughter General. They later recalled the call with tears in their eyes. It was hard to understand anything. The child was screaming unintelligibly into the receiver with a lot of noise in the background, then calls, screams, and then the connection was cut off. Amanda and the children could not be reached, so the concerned grandparents got into the car and drove to their daughter's house to find out what was happening. They were very worried. However, they arrived too late, as the fire that had engulfed the house was visible several streets away. They knew their daughter and grandchildren could be in the house, so they left the car in the driveway, jumped out, and immediately ran into the burning building. They managed to find Jen, who was unconscious on the living room floor. They dragged the girl outside, nearly burning themselves in the fire, but General showed no signs of life. The elderly couple could do nothing more, as they were severely traumatized and burned. They called for help. The grandparents were beside themselves with worry about their daughter and grandchildren's fate. When firefighters and rescue workers arrived, medics provided first aid to the elderly couple. They were then taken to the hospital due to the severity of their burns, but General could not be helped anymore. Doctors confirmed her death. Firefighters fought the blaze in the building for several hours. It was only at dawn that they managed to extinguish the flames that had destroyed much of the house. To make matters worse, evidence also burned in the fire. It was necessary to determine what caused the fire and what had happened in the house that night. Once the last embers were extinguished, firefighters examined the scene of the fire. Initially, it was assumed that the fire was caused by a faulty electrical system. However, later the bodies of the remaining family members were discovered, and the condition of the bodies suggested something much worse. The 34-year-old Amanda, 11-year-old General, and 8-year-old Texas had been brutally stabbed. They had been killed before the fire, as confirmed by the medical examiner, who found no soot in their airways. Reinforcements were called to the scene, and investigators began to investigate the murder case. They also examined the charred house and the victims' bodies. According to all findings, the fire's starting point was Amanda's body, and the intruder had likely used some flammable substance to ignite the flames. Probably, he had also sprayed the furniture, walls, and floor, explaining why it took so long to extinguish the fire. Forensic scientists combed every inch of the ashes for clues. It was immediately clear that electrical appliances had nothing to do with it and that the fire had been deliberately set, likely to hide evidence at the scene of the triple murder. Law enforcement immediately turned to the public through the media. They offered a reward of $4,000 for information leading to the capture of the perpetrator who had brutally murdered a mother and 2 children. The public was shocked by the news of the murder of a small family. It was clear that Amanda had no enemies who would wish her dead. She was a nice, friendly woman. Investigators questioned neighbors and relatives of the victims to find out if there could be a motive for the atrocity. However, no information could be obtained. About 4 weeks passed, during which the police station received dozens of calls from random witnesses hoping to receive a high reward. The individuals provided various information, but no useful data could be obtained to advance the investigation. In the 4th week of the investigation, as the police had already combed the burnt house inch by inch dozens of times, a woman from California called the station and made a startling statement. For security reasons, it was later decided not to name her in the investigation. According to the caller, her acquaintance, the 17-year-old Rachel Pittman, was behind the murder of the family. Initially, it was unclear what made the caller so confident and suspicious. But she provided important information only the investigators knew at that time. Therefore, her statement was credible. The police took her words seriously, followed this lead, and began to verify all the information. The only strange thing about the whole matter was that a person from California, who lived quite far away from the crime in Texas, knew about it. How could she know? Of course, the mysterious stranger was thoroughly checked against the database, but she was not found. It was planned to get in closer contact with her, but the procedure was lengthy due to the great distance. Weeks passed during which all witness requests at the police station were processed. During this time, the investigators managed to contact Rachel and speak to the nanny, who was so confidently accused of the triple murder. The investigators spoke to the girl but could not find anything suspicious. She denied her involvement in the crime and was shocked by what had happened. After all, she knew the family well and had no idea who could have killed the woman and the children. According to her, she had been friends with Amanda and her children for many years, took care of Jen and Texas, and was very close to the family. Rachel had never heard of Amanda having conflicts with others that could have led to such a tragedy. Amanda was quiet and friendly, and her children were real role models. Eventually, The investigators believed that Rachel, due to her young age and cuteness, did not look at all like a suspect in the triple murder. She was genuinely concerned about the tragedy and cooperated with the investigation. Her involvement was considered unlikely, and the search for suspects among other friends and acquaintances of the victims continued. This work took about 3 months but did not bring any progress. At this point, the reward for information leading to the perpetrator's capture was increased by a foundation by another $100,000, but that was not even the turning point. Probably, the perpetrator was simply tormented by his conscience, prompting him to make a shocking confession. About 3 months after the brutal massacre of a single mother and her 2 children, a woman contacted the police station. She was inconsolable and could barely hold back her tears. According to her, her daughter had confessed to the triple murder just a few minutes earlier. The same 17-year-old nanny, Rachel, regularly visited her mother, and during one of the recent visits, it was not a casual chat on the sofa. The girl was tormented by the burden of responsibility and could no longer bear the cruel truth about the night when the house caught fire. This truth was worse than all the investigators' assumptions. Rachel confessed to her mother that she was the one who attacked the family that night and then set the house on fire to destroy the evidence. Rachel's mother was shocked. She had not expected such atrocities from her daughter. Although the motherly instinct always drives one to protect their own child, it did not work in this situation. The details of the crime that the 17-year-old girl confessed to were too gruesome, so her mother decided to report her to the police. This confession secured Rachel's mother a reward of $140,000, but she refused it. She did not act out of selfish motives but simply wanted to do the right thing and punish the perpetrator. Even though it was her daughter. The investigators, who had heard Rachel's name before and had been in contact with her, immediately set out to arrest the perpetrator. As it turned out, this gruesome story was much stranger than it first appeared. During her arrest, the suspect told everything that happened that fateful night in detail. According to the nanny, a friend called her that evening, and they had an inconspicuous conversation. Still, in the end, this woman said she had to kill Amanda. Without going into detail, she spoke as if the matter was urgent and important and ordered the nanny to do it. It seemed that this crime had been planned for a long time, and Rachel was to be the executor of the murder. The nanny had to agree. However, the criminal wanted to wait until the single mother's children were not at home to avoid killing them, but her friend was relentless and demanded that she act immediately. So, Rachel decided to act now, even though the children were at home. The night fire was also no coincidence. The girl knew that killing people would inevitably leave traces that would allow the police to find her. So, she set the fire to destroy all the evidence. It was all planned in advance. On the way to her friend's house, Rachel bought a bottle of lemonade. The girl emptied it and filled it with gasoline at the nearest gas station. After murdering the children and their mother, she poured the flammable liquid over all the bodies and set them on fire. The confession alone, however, was not enough to ensure that the perpetrator would be punished in court. Without direct evidence, the case seemed to be at a dead end. But the nanny made a mistake. During the triple murder, she cut herself with her knife. Naturally, the nanny set the house on fire, destroying all the evidence inside. But as Rachel fled, she jumped over the fence, leaving a bloody stain from her hand, which she tried to wipe off but failed. This material was later collected and analyzed in the lab, proving with 100% certainty that the blood on the fence came from Rachel. The young criminal had a good chance of escaping justice. She managed to kill 3 people without being caught on cameras and had entirely escaped the eyes of witnesses. When Rachel returned home after the murder, she took off all her clothes and burned them along with her shoes. She hid the knife she had broken in the forest, and the wooden handle of the knife was burned along with her clothes. During a search of the forest area where the weapon was supposed to be, investigators could not find it. However, they could almost completely collect the leather sheath of the knife handle, on which Rachel's DNA was found. Despite all this valuable information on which the prosecution's tactics were based, the prosecutor believed that more was behind the crime. The scale of the preparation and the knowledge of eliminating traces indicated a carefully planned murder. It was by no means the impulsive act of a teenager who was persuaded and lured into a crime. Some believed that at least one other accomplice was involved in the crime, who remained unknown throughout the entire process. According to these people, it was the mysterious stranger who first gave Rachel a clue. Investigators met with this mysterious stranger and questioned him. According to the sparse information released to the public, the informant had no motive to be hostile to her friend Amanda. They had been close friends for many years, and the woman was shocked by Rachel's accusations that she had given the order to execute the mother and the children. The woman denied this and successfully passed a lie detector test. Investigators did not consider her a suspect and did not charge her because they also did not believe she was involved in the murder, and this was later confirmed. The logical next step was a psychiatric assessment of Rachel, who behaved very strangely. It was necessary to determine the degree of the murderer's sanity, as her condition could completely discredit the confession. The most suspicious thing about the whole matter was Rachel's confession that she had not decided to commit the crime herself but had been persuaded by an older friend. The police could not confirm the fact of such a conversation. Investigators managed to get hold of a recording of this conversation, but there was no hint of incitement to the crime. The two had a conversation shortly before the murder, but only about ordinary everyday topics. However, there were very serious concerns about her mental health. Several psychiatric experts had worked with the girl, and all were convinced that she suffered from severe mental disorders. The girl indeed believed she had had a dialogue with her older friend, who ordered her to kill Amanda and the children. All this likely pointed to a severe form of deviation, the paranoid schizophrenic spectrum. In some cases, patients with such problems begin to hear voices. They can have obsessions and hallucinations and not recognize what is happening. All this makes such people extremely dangerous, as Rachel clearly demonstrated. But what fate awaited a criminal who suffered from such severe illnesses? She had a good chance of receiving compulsory treatment and avoiding a prison sentence, which was undesirable for the prosecution. The experts carefully analyzed the scanned material at their disposal. It was evident that the perpetrator had acted deliberately. She had meticulously planned the act, eliminated all traces, and could have escaped justice if her conscience had not struck. Rachel was aware that she had committed an atrocity, as she felt the need to cover her tracks to avoid responsibility. The girl knew she faced a severe punishment for the triple murder. The defense also involved a psychiatric expert who sided with Rachel. According to the doctor, the girl's distorted perception could have played a cruel joke under the given circumstances. She might have believed she was doing the right thing and tended to believe that Rachel was insane at that time. This was supported by the formulations the voices used during her conversations with her friend. They demanded that Amanda be freed from her misery. Patients with paranoid schizophrenic disorders often cannot distinguish between right and wrong, but their actions can appear very deliberate. This explained the girl's behavior and the thoroughness with which she eliminated all evidence of the atrocities. The defense also acknowledged the involvement of another person in the crime, but the doctor argued that Rachel's mind had devised the insidious plan and the murder plan itself. The psychiatrist for the prosecution spent hours examining the patient's condition, concluding that the 17-year-old had long had hallucinations. She claimed that shop window signs and even random people on the street whispered to her to free Amanda from her misery. Gradually, it became a kind of obsession that constantly occupied her mind. Rachel began to see it as a command from above, as if the universe itself urged her to commit a crime. But the call from a friend in California was the drop that broke the camel's back. These mental problems persisted for weeks. For a while, the girl heard the voices of snakes. Later, she began to hear demonic sounds and see ghosts. In one of these hallucinations, Rachel saw a pink cloud that, in her opinion, contained the souls of 3 future victims. The madness developed rapidly. The babysitter actually created a cult of personality in which she communicated with the demons in her own head. The accused was tried as an adult because of the severity of the crime, but she was not threatened with the death penalty, which is in force in the state of Texas. In 2013, during the trial, Rachel agreed to a deal with the prosecution to have her sentence commuted. According to her, she went to her longtime friend Amanda's house at 3 a.m. and woke her up. The woman went downstairs to see who was disturbing her family so late. It turned out to be 17-year-old Rachel, who had looked after Amanda's children more than once. She was a longtime family friend and was welcomed with open arms by the single mother. For the children, Rachel was like an older sister. This person was the last one from whom they expected evil. However, this time Rachel did not come to them with good intentions. Despite the late hour, the single mother invited her acquaintance into the house. At the doorstep, Rachel offered her friend Amanda a drink. The babysitter was a little tipsy and wanted to talk to her about everyday problems. And she agreed. The girl had not been quite normal for a while. Her behavior had been strange for some time. Sometimes it seemed as if she could not distinguish between reality and fiction. Initially, they just sat and talked, drinking a little but in moderation, each having a glass of wine. Then the babysitter started a serious conversation with Amanda and wanted to share information she considered important. She believed that the nameless friend was planning something bad against Amanda and the children. And they discussed the problem but eventually concluded that everything was just made up. After a while, the uninvited guest was ready to leave. They went to the living room. The babysitter said goodbye to Amanda, stood up, and walked to the door. But just one step from the exit, she turned around, drew a knife from her belt, and lunged at the woman. There was a screaming fight. Rachel stabbed her several times, ending Amanda's life on the spot. The screams and sounds of the fight woke the children. They came to the living room to see what was happening. The girl was the first to recognize the danger, grabbed her phone, and ran to the back room to escape her attacker and call for help. She managed to dial a number but unfortunately did not call the police or emergency services, instead reaching her grandparents. The babysitter then caught up with her and stabbed her. The same fate awaited her brother. Rachel was unsure if she would have left the children alive if they had not come into the living room and witnessed the attack on their mother. Maybe she would have left the house without touching them, but maybe not, as she planned to destroy the evidence by setting the fire. As part of the deal, Rachel Pittman pleaded guilty to all charges and refused to appeal the verdict. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The defense argued that this was a result of mental illness, but despite their protest, the 17-year-old was sent to a juvenile detention center. However, her condition quickly deteriorated there. According to the guards, Rachel quickly organized a sect within the prison walls, gathering her teenage followers who saw her as their Messiah. She spoke of all the forgiveness that God would inevitably grant, but to achieve this, Rachel preached a cruel and perverse way. Unfortunately, all this was quickly absorbed by the juvenile offenders. The former babysitter gathered several other teenagers around her. One of the sect's characteristics was the need to disrespect the prison guards. This caused many problems and conflicts among themselves and with the guards, which only worsened the situation of the young representatives of the criminal world. For the entire prison staff, it was immediately clear that Rachel was very dangerous. She was completely unpredictable. Most of the time, she seemed normal and did not show her abnormalities when talking calmly about neutral topics. However, as soon as someone touched her in any way, for example, to tell her that she was doing something wrong, she immediately turned cold towards that person, and then it turned into open hatred. The girl could not tolerate criticism, losing control instantly, which repeatedly caused conflicts. From the moment of her imprisonment, her behavior was considered terrible. She was held in a juvenile detention center until 2012. During this time, she had several serious altercations with inmates, one of whom knocked out her teeth. She also made several attempts to escape from her cell. Additionally, she used a piece of paper to jam the cell door lock, allowing her to come and go freely. She was also found guilty of conspiring against one of the other inmates, whom she wanted to attack. On the day Rachel decided to sentence another man to death, she managed to escape from her cell again. She also found a blade from a pencil sharpener, which she used to make an improvised knife. The night before the fight, she cut her hair with the blade so it could not be grabbed and used against her. By the end of her stay in the juvenile detention center, the entire facility staff was convinced that the girl needed medical help. The situation worsened day by day, and Rachel was a frightening mix of dangerous traits. She was very aggressive, showed no fear, and seemed very intelligent and cunning. According to the guards, only a psychiatric institution could help calm this monster. After these incidents, the young woman was transferred to a women's prison in Texas. So far, there are no signs of improvement, and the criminal with clear signs of mental illness continues to plot in prison. She faces a life sentence but could be released on parole in August 2041. One can hardly imagine what people in the surrounding towns will expect when the brutal murderer, who is particularly bitter, is released. That will happen when she is 47 years old. So far, there are still many white spots in this case, so the motive for such a brutal murder remains unclear. After all, Rachel was a trusted friend of the family. What could have motivated her to such aggression? Many people still believe that Rachel could not have committed such a sophisticated and brutal murder alone. This means that another accomplice remains at large. Is it possible that she deliberately covered up the crime against the background of a worsening mental illness so thoroughly? The convicted person's lawyer believes that the police only wanted to quickly close the case without really investigating and therefore took every opportunity to put Rachel in prison. The prosecution counters that they presented a whole series of solid evidence that leaves no doubt about the guilt of the 17-year-old girl. Moreover, the defendant, after communicating with the mysterious older friend, did not name any other names that could be considered. The case was so sensational that locals still remember the murder in the house with horror and await the release of the dangerous criminal with fear. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.
What can happen to a girl who is just walking in one of the safest areas of America? Normally nothing, but that changes when a real monster goes hunting at the same time. April Millsap was born on January 2000. In the summer of 2014, she lived with her family in Armada, a small town in the state of Michigan, USA. April was a friendly and kind 14-year-old girl who attended the local high school. She had no brothers or sisters. When she was 6 years old, her parents separated. Her mother began a relationship with another man named David, and April and her stepfather quickly found common ground and maintained a warm relationship. She was very cheerful and had a pronounced sense of humor which always delighted her family. Her positive outlook on life allowed her to surround herself with many friends who gathered around her. April was creative, liked to draw, led an active lifestyle, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Despite her young age, she seemed more mature than her peers. At the age of 14, she was already quite independent and walked her dog alone. She loved spending time with her friends, but was also close to her family. April had a boyfriend named Austin who was a year older. They went to school together and met there. By the time of the events in question, they had been together for about a year. In 2014, about 1,700 people lived in Armada. The place seemed safe, ideal for a family to live and raise children. Everyone literally knew each other by sight, but as life shows, such circumstances make such places very attractive to villains. Here they rarely operate, but they cause real panic. On July 24, 2014, the summer holidays were in full swing. That day, April didn't want to go anywhere and sought a quiet corner. She slept until noon and then spent the whole day on the computer, chatting with friends and playing a little. Around 6 p.m., she decided to take her dog Penny for a walk. She often took the animal with her, including with friends and her boyfriend Austin, so it was this time. She chose one of the usual walking routes she often took to relax. Normally, such walks didn't last more than an hour. The girl hadn't taken her pet out for a long time, and her mother waited at home calmly. But even after an hour and a half, April still hadn't appeared. The mother tried to call her daughter and sent her several text messages, but instead of answering the call, it went to voicemail and the messages remained unread. The woman became worried and called her daughter's boyfriend Austin, assuming the two were together. When the young man reported that he hadn't seen his girlfriend all day but had only chatted with her online, Jennifer went into real panic. She continued to call the students' friends, but no one knew where April could be. Less than half an hour later, there was a knock at the door. The mother expected her daughter to finally return from her walk and breathed a sigh of relief. But it was actually Austin and his friend standing at the door. According to him, both had come to make sure the girl was okay, but he couldn't find April either. The young man seemed agitated and showed Jennifer a text message he had received from April at 6:28 p.m., about 40 minutes after she left the house for a walk with her dog. Although Austin had previously claimed he hadn't received any messages from his girlfriend, he now slightly changed his story. He said he either didn't notice the message immediately or was out of range before. But as soon as he managed to check, he received it very late. According to him, the content was very disturbing. A short sentence, "Someone tried to kidnap me." He then got scared and started searching. Jennifer took the words seriously and immediately called her husband David at work. The man panicked and apologized to his boss to join Austin, his friend, and his wife in searching for the girl. They all knew the routes April had taken and split up to cover a large area and several paths at once that April might have taken. The mother called the police, who also joined the search for the missing teenager. Soon the missing person was found. According to a man and a woman who were jogging on one of the paths around 8:20 p.m., they came across a dog. The animal was on a leash but was not being followed by anyone. The woman tried to take hold of the dog's leash, but it was very restless. The dog started running away from them and stopped as if it wanted to show something. The couple followed the animal. The dog ducked into a dense bush, and behind it they found the girl's body. It was a densely overgrown area that concealed a ravine. The girl was later identified as 14-year-old April Millsap. However, it was not simple. When the girl's relatives arrived at the discovery site, the medical examiners were already at work. Law enforcement officers from other regions with greater resources were immediately involved in the investigation. This was because in Armada there were only 2 police officers trained for this kind of work and with the necessary experience. Crime was extremely rare here, so a few officers were quite enough to deal with local thieves. But not this time. None of the police officers had ever been confronted with a brutal murder. Since the sheriff had virtually no resources for the investigation, he immediately turned to the more competent authorities in the county. April was found lying on her back at the bottom of a ravine. Her shoes had been taken off and placed a few meters away from her body. Her clothing and underwear had been pulled down, clearly indicating a sexual motive for the crime. However, further examination revealed that the girl had not been raped. Investigators suspected that there was an attempt, but April apparently fought back desperately and thwarted her attacker's plans, or he was frightened by someone, perhaps by a dog or a random passerby. In any case, the girl was brutally beaten. She had bruises all over her body, from defensive wounds to her face. It was so disfigured that it was even crushed. The medical examiner could identify at least 48 separate injuries, many concentrated on the face and neck area. The victim was covered in dried blood. The expert also noted signs of neck compression. However, these were not characteristic of classic strangulation with bare hands or a foreign object. April's face and neck had strange impressions. Analysis revealed that they were shoe prints. This means the perpetrator stepped on her and trampled her. The medical examiner wrote in his report that April was actually trampled to death. On her head and neck were impressions resembling the shape of the soles of oversized sneakers. Given the motive, it was clearly a large man. Furthermore, the forensic expert determined that the execution lasted more than 10 minutes and the girl died in terrible agony. The precise identification of the victim was difficult up to that point due to the nature of the injuries to her face, which had become unrecognizable. Only her relatives, who were searching for the teenager at the time when police officers were already on site, could identify her based on her clothing and jewelry. It was impossible to tell who was lying before them by looking at the face, which shocked the relatives, especially her mother. Right from the start, the mother, stepfather, boyfriend, and his friend were taken to the police station for questioning. They were to be interviewed to narrow down possible suspects and clarify recent events in the victim's life. The mother and stepfather were quickly removed from the list. After that, the police became interested in the victim's boyfriend, Austin. The officers immediately became suspicious when the young man began to say that his relationship with his beloved had been difficult lately. They argued often and the couple was even on the verge of breaking up. Shortly before the murder, they argued again. Another suspicious revelation from Austin was a text message. She wrote to him that someone had tried to kidnap her, but he simply ignored this frightening message. Austin himself insisted, however, that it couldn't have been him because the message arrived too late and he hadn't seen it. Apparently, there was some kind of glitch and the message was delivered very late. According to investigators, he reacted extremely sluggishly after receiving the message. He didn't report it to the police and simply went searching for her. According to Austin, he still held a grudge against his girlfriend and saw the message as a manipulation attempt. The young man thought she wanted to arouse his interest and concern so that he would reconcile with her first. He didn't realize it was so serious. Regarding the argument, Austin emphasized that April's behavior had been incomprehensible. The recent conflict came out of nowhere, and he was never able to determine the exact reason for their disagreement, instead blaming the girl. All this reinforced the investigators' suspicion that Austin might have a motive for the attack. In most cases, it is the partners who commit assaults. The officers decided to detain him longer and asked him to recount his daily routine in detail to analyze his movements and check his possible alibi. Austin said he met his friend around 4 p.m. to help him bring a television into the house. Afterwards, they went to a nearby McDonald's to have a snack. Finally, his statements were checked. Surveillance cameras at McDonald's indeed showed him there at the stated time. This happened around 6:30 p.m., just minutes after the message about the attempted kidnapping was sent. It was obvious that Austin could not have been involved in the murder. Since he couldn't be the murderer, it was decided to take the victim's mobile phone for analysis, hoping it would provide further information. It was suspected that the girl might have received a text message from a stalker who was after her. However, the victim's mobile phone could not be found at the crime scene. Investigators suspected that the perpetrator had taken the mobile phone, turned it off, and deposited it elsewhere so it couldn't be traced. In search of the phone and other evidence, forensic technicians began examining the entire route April was supposed to have taken, but without success. Police officers with specially trained dogs and even the FBI were brought in. After an almost 24-hour search, everything seemed in vain, but the efforts paid off. The very next day, about a kilometer from the crime scene, her phone was found and immediately sent to a crime lab for examination. The victim's mobile phone provided interesting information. In particular, it was learned that she actively communicated at school with a man named Roger, who was known for his bad mood and often got into trouble. However, during the check, the young man was also removed from the list of suspects. It turned out he had a confirmed alibi. During the same period, information about the brutal attack was released to the public via local newspapers and television stations. The authorities tried to locate witnesses who might have noticed something suspicious along the route at the time of the crime. In the initial phase, however, the public was only agitated and the close-knit community of the town was frightened. People were afraid to leave their homes and let their children go outside unsupervised since the perpetrator was still at large. Most striking was the brutality of the attack and the fact that it occurred in broad daylight. No one could feel safe. Suddenly, a girl reported to the police station and made some strange statements. According to her, on the fateful day when April was killed, around 6 p.m., she was at home and looking out the window when she saw a white van driving by that she had never seen here before. A man was at the wheel and another young man was in the passenger seat. They drove very slowly through the area as if looking for someone or something, which immediately seemed strange to her. When the suspicious pair saw her through the window, they suddenly stopped. Both stared at her and pointed a finger at her house. All this gave the witness a bad feeling, then they drove away. Now that she had learned of April's murder, she feared the two men might have something to do with it. Perhaps they saw April as a suitable victim and attacked her. The investigators considered this information important. They agreed that the white van could indeed have been driving around the area looking for a victim, and that April was ultimately the one who had the bad luck to be in the men's sights. The police officers turned to the public again and released a description of the white van and a composite sketch of the two men inside, hoping to get more precise information. The very next day, a man and his buddy reported to the station. They stated that they had indeed been out on the street in the van that evening. The men were involved in construction and renovation work. They were driving slowly through the neighborhood because the van driver had worked here before and was showing his colleague the houses he had recently worked on. The house where the girl was located was also on this list. Their statements were checked and the suspicion against the men was cleared. The residents wanted to advance the investigation in every conceivable way. Another day later, several people reported to the station and pointed out a suspicious motorcycle and its rider. These individuals had seen April when the student was on the hiking trail with her dog around 6:30 p.m. The witnesses pointed out that she was not alone, but that at that time an adult, much older man was walking with her, pushing his motorcycle with his hands. They were walking and seemed to be just talking. At the time, people simply assumed it was the girl's father as he aroused no suspicion and behaved calmly. April also didn't seem frightened, but now after reconsidering the situation, she had doubts about this man. None of the victim's friends or family members could recognize this man from his description. He was clearly a stranger to April until then. According to witness descriptions, the encounter occurred around the same time that April sent her boyfriend the text message about the kidnapping that hadn't happened. So suspicion against this man grew. There were few motorcyclists in town, and the man immediately drew the attention of the locals, and the appearance of the motorcycle was very unusual, a rare blue-white color. The description was accurate, and so just 3 days after April's murder, on July 27, 2014, a motorcycle was found that exactly matched the description. It was parked in the driveway of a local house. When police arrived here, the vehicle was still next to the house. They approached a man working in the garden, and he informed them that it was not his motorcycle. The motorcycle belonged to his 32-year-old friend James Van Callies, who lived in the neighboring town of Goodells, about 30 km from Armada. This information was confirmed. On July 28, the officers met with the owner of the motorcycle to speak with him and clarify how he had spent the day April was killed. From the beginning, James was willing to cooperate with the police and answer all questions. He stated that at that time he had been at a friend's house in Armada, and the friend confirmed his story. However, in the opinion of the authorities, this alibi was not sufficiently reliable, since the confirming witness was a friend who might be covering for the perpetrator. Also, there were slight inconsistencies in the timeline. The man was asked about the shoes he had worn that day. He provided a pair of white sneakers, but their tread did not match the impressions on the victim's body. There were no bloodstains on the sneakers. Suspicion arose that they were the wrong shoes. The investigators then decided to get to know James better to remove him from the list of possible murderers. He had a number of convictions, though not for violent crimes. He had been charged with burglary and failure to pay child support. The robberies occurred in 2005 and 2006. However, while reviewing the man's criminal record, the police discovered something much more frightening. His father, James Van Callies Sr., was a registered sex offender with a preference for sexual assaults. During this period, both men lived in the same family house. As it turned out, James Van Callies Sr. had been convicted of criminal behavior towards a minor child who was barely 13 years old at the time of the molestation. It was suspected that both men could be involved in criminal incidents. However, it was the son who was the focus of interest because it was a middle-aged man who was seen by eyewitnesses. He was identified by the eyewitnesses. During a house search, it turned out that the two were growing illegal plants on their property. The quantity was so large that they were arrested and charged with trafficking illegal substances. In this way, the alleged criminals were kept out of the public, and the investigation could continue without the risk of them fleeing the country. The police checked all the shoes found in the men's residence, but none of the treads matched the marks on the girl's body. Numerous DNA tests were also conducted on the clothing, but no matches could be found with the footprints on April. However, forensic experts examining the motorcycle were certain that it had been thoroughly cleaned with strong cleaning agents shortly before the police took it for analysis. It was assumed that this was an attempt to wash away evidence, and it was very successful as no traces remained. The investigators' theory was quickly confirmed when James Jr.'s girlfriend named Crystal contacted the station. She reported that on the day of April's murder, she came home and found James cleaning his shoes, his motorcycle, and his helmet. He was so thorough and used strong disinfectants that she suspected something was wrong. The impressions on April's head looked like helmet marks, and it was likely that James had used the helmet during the crime. Crystal also reported that during the day he had driven by car to his brother's house in a neighboring town where the victim of the massacre also lived. She described a pair of his sneakers, which were his preferred black and white Air Jordans, but these did not match the ones he presented to the investigators during their first encounter. Crystal also said that she never saw those sneakers again after that night. Probably the perpetrator got rid of his favorite shoes because he feared he wouldn't be able to wash away all the traces. The woman told the police in detail about her relationship with James. According to her, he was a very violent and abusive man. Lately, she had felt like a hostage and property of the man. James controlled absolutely every aspect of her life and even forbade her to leave the house if he couldn't accompany her. She hadn't trusted him from the beginning, but she was afraid he would kill her if she went to the police. Now that the perpetrator's family had been caught, she could speak without fear. According to James's own admission to his lover, he had cleaned his things because he had gotten them dirty with machine oil while repairing his bike. However, she didn't believe him. The police had to prove that the perpetrator had actually worn the shoes mentioned by Crystal. They managed to find photos on James's social media page showing him wearing sneakers that matched the description. Of course, James had gotten rid of the pair of shoes he wore on the day of the murder. But that didn't stop the police from finding and buying the exact same pair to match the tread pattern with the impressions on the victim's body. The forensics experts immediately found a clear match. April Millsap was trampled to death, and the perpetrator wore exactly the same sneakers that James had bought about a year before the attack. A check of the perpetrator's computer confirmed the fears. He was clearly interested in girls of a much younger age. An even more valuable piece of information was the girl's mobile phone, which was analyzed in the FBI lab. It turned out that she had installed a fitness application that recorded movement speed, steps, heart rate, and other parameters. Shortly after the disturbing message to her boyfriend Austin, she significantly accelerated her steps, as if trying to run away from someone. Apparently, James Van Callies approached her on his motorcycle and offered her something, whereupon the girl sent her boyfriend a text message about the attempted kidnapping. At the same moment, she accelerated to escape her pursuer. Just a few minutes later, the fitness app showed a multiple increase in activity. The steps were chaotic and excessively fast. This lasted for 10 to 15 minutes. Apparently, this recorded the moment of the student's fight for her life, which she unfortunately lost. Some time later, the perpetrator reached his vehicle with the stolen phone. The app now showed a speed of about 20 km per hour, which was maintained until the moment the phone was discarded a kilometer away from the place where April was attacked. Along the motorcyclist's route, there were several surveillance cameras, and the police were able to apprehend him. It was the same motorcycle and the 32-year-old James Van Callies Jr. Geolocation of his mobile phone confirmed that at the time of the attack he was not at a friend's house but near the crime scene. There was now no doubt that he was involved in the murder. By this time, the police had enough evidence to charge him with April's murder and bring him to trial. However, there was a problem, as no direct evidence could be found. The police had no DNA linking the perpetrator to the victim. Against this background, the defense could, of course, effectively plead circumstantial evidence. However hard the forensic experts tried, it was not possible to find the victim's blood on the equipment and the perpetrator's helmet. He had thoroughly cleaned and disposed of all the evidence. Obviously, the man was very experienced in these matters. Finally, the prosecution decided to take the risk, despite the circumstantial evidence, of which there were many. It was assumed that they would be sufficient to convince the jurors of James's guilt. In October 2014, 3 months after the crime, the man was indicted and a trial was scheduled for early 2016. It was suspected that he had attacked the teenager because of her refusal of intimacy. He had spent a long time searching online for various seduction methods to find out how to attract a much younger girl, especially a minor. But apparently, all these tips didn't work. To the victim's misfortune, the man could not accept a no and attacked the girl. Predictably, the defense tried to convince the jurors that the prosecution did not have a single irrefutable proof of James's guilt and that all the prosecution's tactics were based only on circumstantial evidence. The criminal professed his innocence, but all this seemed unconvincing. The defense's last attempt was to point out that the accused had never been involved in a serious crime before. Fortunately, that was not enough to acquit James. After several hours of deliberation, the jury found him unanimously guilty of attempted kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder. As a result, James Van Callies Jr. was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. April Millsap's mother spoke at the sentencing with a long speech. The woman expressed satisfaction with the court's decision and the fact that the perpetrator would never be free again. She was shocked that a child could die at the hands of an adult man just because he was rejected. His actions and thoughts were criminal from the start, but the cruelty was disproportionate to anything. Nevertheless, James neither admitted his guilt nor regretted it. He continued to insist that he did not commit the crime. Immediately after his conviction, he tried to challenge the court's decision and filed an appeal with the help of a lawyer, but without success. He remains behind bars to this day. After the brutal massacre of the innocent girl, a memorial garden was created near the place where her life was literally trampled underfoot in memory of April. There is also a small statue there in the form of the dog named Penny, who led strangers to the place where her owner was brutally murdered. Unfortunately, the animal was not able to find help quickly enough to save her life. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.
When objects began to move in the Bones house, Frank, the father, accused his daughters of having orchestrated the whole thing. But who knew that the evil spirit the girls had summoned during a séance was real? In the autumn of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his two daughters, 15-year-old Tina and 9-year-old Karen, suffered a terrible loss. The girl's mother died suddenly of cancer. This was a great tragedy, not only emotionally, but also financially. The girl's parents had worked hard to make ends meet, and now the entire burden of providing for the family rested on Frank's shoulders. With the girls left without their mother, their father mainly wanted to be there for them, support them, and somehow comfort them. But instead, he was forced to work overtime, take night shifts, and work on weekends just to keep the family afloat. Not long after his wife's burial, Frank stayed late at work, and his poor girls, crushed by grief and longing for their mother, were alone at home. The sisters sat in the living room, telling stories, remembering the happy times when Mom was still there, and they were sad. They missed her desperately. The only thing that mattered to them at that moment was to communicate once more with the closest person on earth. Due to their age, they couldn't quite believe that their mother had left them and would never come back. The girls' entire lives were turned upside down in an instant. And on that evening, when the sisters were alone at home, they had such an irresistible need to talk to their mother that they decided to hold a séance. Actually, they didn't expect anything fantastic to happen. They just wanted to distract themselves from their sorrow and timidly hoped that their mother would answer them. The girls had a Ouija board, which is basically used to speak with the dead. The board looked like a game board and was inscribed with letters and numbers, as well as the words yes, no, and goodbye. The set had a wooden planchette, which the spirits could use to answer the questions posed. The sisters went down to the basement and did what they thought should be done during a Ouija session. They lit candles, held hands, and even sang a few songs. They didn't really take what they were doing seriously, but deep down they hoped for a miracle. What if Mom had something to say to them? The girls placed their fingers on the wooden planchette and began to ask questions in a whisper. If the spirit of the deceased was in the room, it should theoretically have moved the pointer board and given signs. No matter how much the sisters pleaded with their mother to answer them, nothing happened. The planchette did not move. They waited, reformulated the questions, hoping that they would at least get a hint that she could hear them, and so on and so forth, but all in vain. The girls were disappointed. They wanted so badly to believe that their mother was there and watching over them, but for some reason, she didn't want to show herself. After putting the Ouija board away, they went upstairs to their rooms. The failed seance with the other world was another reminder that Mom was truly gone. She was dead. The girls crawled into their beds and tried to sleep. Since Daddy was still at work, they had to cope with their daily routine alone. Tina and Karen couldn't sleep, but suddenly, at some point, they both heard a knocking coming from below, either from the ground floor or the basement. The knocking was inconspicuous, like a mechanism working loudly, the sound of which was more clearly heard in the silence of the night, or like tree branches outside hitting the side of the house in the wind. Both girls lay in their beds, listening and trying to guess where the sound was coming from. And if it didn't bother them at first, the younger Karen felt a kind of fear. So she got out of bed, looked out of her room, and tiptoed across the hallway to her older sister's room. Tina was also awake and wanted to find out where the knocking was coming from. The girls went to the stairs and began to listen. Dad wasn't home yet, so they didn't risk going downstairs. They simply stood on the landing on the first floor and tried to understand the reason for the strange noises. At some point, one of the girls suggested that the knocking sound might be coming from Mom. What if the Ouija session they had done had worked, and Mom had appeared to them when called and was now giving them signs? The sisters' excitement suddenly grew. One of them quietly asked, "Mommy, is that you?" And at the same moment, there was a soft knock. Tina and Karen looked at each other and repeated the question, and again there was a soft knock, exactly like the first time. It was frightening, but at the same time, it was what they wanted, what they held the session for. They needed some time with their mother. The girls were sure that the spirit of the dead woman was answering them at that moment, but that no longer terrified them. The sisters became excited, and in their excitement ran downstairs and asked more and more questions. They had already realized that the sound was coming from the basement. It seemed as if Mom had been in the house with them the entire time. She just didn't know how to show herself so as not to scare her daughters. When they opened the basement door, Tina and Karen stopped. Although they were sure that their mother was talking to them, for some reason they were afraid to go down the stairs. The girls kept asking questions and got answers in the form of knocks from the dark basement, and after about 20 to 30 minutes, everything stopped abruptly. No matter how much the girls urged their mother to come back and continue talking, there was no sound in response. Tina and Karen were so excited that they didn't notice their father coming home. Frank was very surprised when his daughters ran towards him, excitedly telling him about a kind of seance. The clock struck midnight, and for some reason the girls hadn't gone to bed yet. With shining eyes, they told their father the story of how they had communicated with their dead mother and how she had answered them by knocking. Honestly, the man was confused. However, he knew that his daughters were going through a very difficult time in their lives after the loss of their mother, and for the first time in the short period since the burial, he saw that the girls were genuinely happy. Frank was undeterred and determined to protect and care for them. Satisfied that they had found a way to talk to their mother, Tina and Karen finally went to bed, and the tired Frank assumed that this was a defense mechanism of the children's psyche. His girls were slowly learning to cope with the terrible loss. In the following days, the strange noises in the house continued. Now the soft knocking no longer came only from the basement, but from the kitchen, the living room, sometimes from the first floor, from everywhere. However, the girls were the only ones who heard the knocking. For example, if Frank was at home, Mom's ghost did not answer for some reason. Their father was even convinced that the daughters had invented a kind of game to get used to the fact that their mother was no longer there. He even played along a bit with Tina and Karen. But when the knocking continued a few days after the session, the girls began to change their attitude towards these strange noises. While at first they were quite sure they were communicating with their mother, doubts now crept in, and the sisters began to feel afraid. Gradually, the sounds shifted from the basement to the first floor and came exclusively from their bedrooms at night.
The sisters lay in their beds and heard strange knocking sounds under the bed, from the wardrobe, or from above. Now it was really scary, and they complained to their father that the ghost was keeping them from sleeping. Frank went into the bedrooms, examined the wardrobes, looked under the beds, but found nothing. The man tried to talk to the children and explain to them that the knocking was just a figment of their imagination. He assured his daughters that while their mother's soul was with them, it could not manifest itself in the physical world. But instead of calming down, Karen and Tina claimed that the seance had let a strange evil spirit into the house, which was now bothering them. At this point, Frank decided that if this didn't stop, he would send the girls for grief counseling. After a short time, the sisters became afraid to stay at home alone, especially at night. Frank tried to invite friends over and leave the girls with relatives, but that couldn't go on forever. One evening, when the sisters were alone at home, there was knocking again, but this time it seemed to be coming from downstairs. The girls were sitting in the kitchen, preparing their dinner. The knocking was slowly becoming bothersome and annoying. The older sister, Tina, suggested that since Dad didn't believe them, they should deal with this evil spirit alone. The schoolgirl grabbed a kitchen knife and went with her sister to the basement. It was damn scary, but the girls finally wanted to deal with the strange noises from the afterlife. The sisters carefully went down the basement stairs and reassured themselves. They hoped to find the real cause and speculated that it could have been a raccoon, a cat, or another animal that had gotten into the house. When the girls went down to the lowest step, they looked at a few boxes of unnecessary things, and that was all. No animal, no person, no one making noises downstairs, and they became afraid again. After a few minutes, the sisters turned around and were about to go back up the stairs when they noticed a message written in the wall in red paint. It read, "I am in your closet. Come and find me." Tina and Karen stormed up the stairs screaming, jumped out of the house, and ran to a neighbor. Their neighbor was about to go to bed when there was a knock at the door. Slightly surprised, he opened the lock and saw the sisters. Confused, the girls told him about a kind of spiritualist session, an evil spirit, strange knocking sounds, and an incomprehensible inscription in the basement. The confused neighbor, who didn't know how to react, simply invited the girls to come in and wait for their father, who was returning home from work. When Frank Bowen returned late at night from work, he was called by the neighbor. The man explained that the girls had been scared by noises in the house and an unclear inscription in the basement, and therefore had run to him. Tina and Karen's father explained to the neighbor that the daughters had become very nervous after the death of their mother and were afraid of every noise, but when assured him that he would check the house immediately and convince himself that there was no reason to panic. Of course, Frank knew that the girls' games with the other world had negatively affected their psyche. Deep down, he blamed himself. He should have taken the children's fantasies more seriously from the beginning and stopped further discussions on the subject. But he had made a mistake, and now the situation was out of control. The man was more than sure that apart from his daughters, there was no one in the house. Probably, Tina and Karen had decided to play a trick on him and make him believe that an evil spirit had spoken to them. Frank went into the house and searched all the rooms, the kitchen, the wardrobes, and the basement. On the wall of the basement, he found a sign that read, "I am in your closet. Come and find me," made with ketchup. But apart from the strange inscription, no one and nothing was in the house. The father decided that his children might be trying to get his attention in this way. Their mother had died, and he himself was working all the time, while his daughters were bored alone. Bowen returned to his neighbor's house, took the children with him, and decided to have a serious talk with them. Annoyed, the father explained that they had played so much with ghosts that they themselves believed in their existence. The father explained to his daughters that the longing for their mother was causing them to invent and do things that did not exist. Frank did not bother to find out why they had painted the basement walls, as he considered it a prank, and promised to take them to a therapist tomorrow who would support them in their grief. Apparently, he believed that Tina and Karen needed professional help, as they could not cope with the loss of their mother alone. In a way, the girls agreed with their father, because they were the only ones who had heard the strange knocking in the house. The only thing that worried them was that none of them had written on the basement wall. As promised, Frank took the children to a specialist the next day. From that day on, all the strange knocking in the house stopped. No one left strange messages in the rooms. It was quiet and peaceful. Everything stood still, as if the world had returned to the Bones house. On December 8, 1986, 3 weeks after the girls started therapy, Frank went to the cafe with Tina, Karen, and their friend Kathleen to eat ice cream. The girls were just getting used to having only their father as a parent and were having a lot of fun. They didn't get home until after dark. When the Bones drove to the house, they were surprised that the lights in the house were still on. Had they really forgotten to turn them off before they left? Frank went onto the porch, opened the front door, and immediately saw a strange scene inside that made no sense. The TV and radio were on. The furniture on the ground floor of the house had obviously been moved, turned to the other side, and some things were simply not where they usually stood. Frank looked around the rooms on the ground floor and looked back at the girls in surprise. Could it be that they were still playing these creepy games with the ghost? Tina and Karen were with him the whole time. They couldn't have caused the mess in the house. But a stranger wouldn't do something like that either, because nothing was missing from the house. It was just an inexplicable wildness. Instead of leaving the house and calling the police, as anyone else would have done, Frank casually went into the house and began searching the rooms to find the person who had caused the chaos. Tina, Karen, and their friend Kathleen hid behind the man's back and followed him. Bowen turned off the TV and radio, moved the living room furniture back, and tidied up everything else. He walked around the entire ground floor and found no one. Then Frank went to the first floor and began systematically searching the bedrooms. The three girls crouched together anxiously and followed the man because they were scared. The first floor was also empty. They searched the attic in the same way and then went down to the basement, but they didn't find anyone there either. Frank stood with the girls in the middle of the living room and didn't understand what was going on. All the windows and doors were locked and there were no signs of a break-in. Who could have broken into their house and rearranged it? And why was this done? It wasn't a ghost, after all, was it? The man realized that they hadn't checked another room on the ground floor. It was a small room right next to the main entrance with windows facing the street. There was almost nothing in it, just an old built-in closet that Bowen had wanted to dismantle a long time ago, but hadn't managed to. The room had not been used, so the man had not paid much attention to it. Now he stood in front of the door and thought that if no one was there, then the whole house had been checked and they were safe. Frank cautiously opened the door and looked inside. Directly in front of him, written on the wall with shaving cream, was, "I am in your closet." Dad asked the girls to stay outside and walked over to the inscription. At first he thought it was another stupid joke of his daughter's. Frank looked back at them, and at that moment he heard an unusual rustling sound in the closet. The closet doors slowly opened, and in the darkness, Bones saw a man. He was a young man with clown makeup on, dressed in Frank's dead wife's dress and a blonde wig, and he was holding an axe. As soon as the stranger took a step toward the homeowner, the father ordered the girls to quickly run upstairs and lock themselves in the bedroom, and in the meantime he himself blocked the madman's path. A fight ensued between the two, during which Frank managed to push the intruder away. Bowen immediately rushed upstairs to the girls' bedroom and locked the door, because the intruder didn't seem to have any intention of retreating. The older girl, Tina, realized that they were trapped and climbed out the window and down from the first floor to the ground. Although she didn't feel any pain during the unfortunate landing, she ran to the nearest neighbors, screaming that a criminal had broken into their house. The police arrived only a few minutes later. They saw Frank at the window on the first floor of the Bones house, screaming that the intruder was somewhere in the house, that he wanted to break down the door to their bedroom. but when he heard the police sirens, he disappeared somewhere. The officers placed a ladder against the first-floor window. Frank and the two girls climbed down. They were unharmed, but very scared. Only after the owner and the children had left the house safely did the police officers enter the house with arms drawn.
They were searched the entire building for the man with clown makeup and an axe in his hand, but they didn't find anyone in the house. The axe was lying next to the rear sliding glass door, which was partially open. The officers concluded that the intruder had fled. The officers spoke to the head of the family, Frank, and asked him to stay with relatives for a while. They themselves promised to monitor the property around the clock and just see what happens next. The investigators also wanted to find out who might have attacked the family, and to do this, they wanted to check old criminal records. Frank and the girls stayed with a friend for a while. Nothing happened for 2 days. No one entered or left the Bones' house. The police searched the city and checked former inmates, but there were no leads for the investigation. 48 hours after the attack, Frank decided to stop by his house to pick up some of his belongings. They had been in such a hurry to stay somewhere else that they had forgotten to take some things with them. The man hoped to meet law enforcement officers who were supposed to be watching the house. However, no one was nearby. Frank got out of the car and walked to the front door of his own house. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement at the window on the first floor. The owner briefly considered that the police might have been lying in wait for him inside, but was very surprised that he had not been warned. He went to his neighbor's house and called the investigator handling the case. The investigator explained that they were watching the house from the outside, that an officer had left the house and was supposed to be replaced by another. Frank hung up the phone, went outside, and actually saw a car in which a police officer was sitting. After the officer heard the homeowner's story, he was very surprised. He explained that in the 48 hours they had been guarding his house, no one had entered it. To be on the safe side, they decided to check the situation. When the police officer opened the door of the Bones' house and glanced inside, he immediately realized that someone had been there. He called for backup, and several officers searched all the rooms, both floors, the attic, and the basement with their weapons drawn. Again, they found no one, but this time too, they were convinced that the intruder had definitely entered the house. The furniture had been moved. A knife had been stabbed into a photo hanging on the wall, and the walls were covered with strange inscriptions. "I'm back. Find me if you can. You will die soon," and the like. The investigators also searched the exterior area. There were no strange footprints in the snow. Assuming that Frank had actually seen someone in the house, this meant that the perpetrator was still hiding in the house. After several hours of searching, the officers stopped in the basement. The police officers were just discussing among themselves what they might have overlooked when one of the officers leaned against the washing machine. The device moved slightly, and a gap became visible in the wall behind it. When the officer shone a flashlight into the depths, he saw a youth in the corner behind the wall. The boy was pulled out of the wall and taken to the police station. Daniel LaPlante was born on May 16, 1970, in the small town of Townshend on the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts. The boy had a difficult, traumatic childhood in which he was physically and psychologically abused and mistreated by his father and stepfather. Recently, he had been living with his mother, stepfather, and 2 brothers. The harsh upbringing had consequences. The boy grew up to be an aggressive, unsociable person who bullied his classmates and never went to school parties or spoke to anyone in particular. At school, Daniel suffered from learning difficulties due to dyslexia. Dyslexia is a learning disorder characterized by difficulties in reading and writing. As a teenager, the boy was also diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. When he was taken to a psychiatrist, the teenager was even more traumatized. The doctor took advantage of the minor patient's reluctance and began to harass him. Daniel had almost no friends. His classmates considered him strange. The boy was unkempt, constantly came to school in dirty clothes, and smelled bad. As a result, the other students tried to avoid him. Instead of spending his time like most teenagers, Daniel began to sneak into other people's houses. His aim was less about stealing and more about driving the owners crazy. He snuck in and intentionally moved things around, shifted furniture, and left empty drink cans visible somewhere.
He liked to watch people get nervous and not understand what was going on. One day, Daniel broke into the Bones' house and saw 15-year-old Tina in a photo. He liked her very much. He got her phone number and started calling. LaPlante introduced himself as a friend of Tina's classmate. He described himself as a good-looking young man, and the teenagers talked on the phone for a while. Then, they arranged a date. Tina was very nervous because she wanted to meet her new acquaintance. When the doorbell rang, she hurried to open the door and was surprised to be frozen on the doorstep. The young man did not look at all like he had described himself in the phone conversation. Standing in front of her was a small, thin teenager with messy hair. His face was covered in pimples. The girl tried to hide her disappointment and went for a walk anyway. She told Danny about her family and mentioned that her mother had recently died of cancer. She felt quite uncomfortable when the young man started asking about the details of her mother's death. After spending about an hour with him, the schoolgirl said goodbye and made it clear that there would be no second meeting. At that moment, 16-year-old Danny decided to act differently. He snuck back into the Bones' house and hid in the basement in the spaces between the walls. He set up a kind of secret hideout. Later, numerous items were found in the basement, including a sleeping bag, beer cans, and several items of clothing that had been stolen from the homeowner's wardrobes. A young man of slight build could safely move into the basement and part of the ground floor by moving through the spaces between the walls. To gain access to other rooms, he left his hideout and hid in different parts of the house. All of this happened over a period of several weeks. When the family was at home, Danny stayed in his hideout. As soon as they left the house, he came out and simply wandered around the house, sometimes rearranging a few items or simply watching TV. When the girls held the séance to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement. First, he just watched the sisters, and then he came up with the idea of pretending to be the spirit of the deceased and giving a signal. That's how the schoolgirls heard the knocking. But when Frank came home from work, he naturally stopped knocking. That led the father to think that his daughters were only imagining it. When Danny realized that the sisters were afraid of the signals from the other side, he became bolder and hid in the sisters' rooms to scare them even more. He could hear what they were talking about, so he could anticipate their actions, and knew that they wouldn't look for him because they were afraid. One day, he disguised himself as the dead wife and suddenly heard a car drive up to the house. He didn't have time to hide in the basement, so he hid in the closet and took an axe with him just in case. It is not known what the teenager was thinking at that moment when he used the axe to break down the bedroom door where the residents of the house had barricaded themselves. However, he heard police sirens and managed to escape to the basement, barricading the entrance with the washing machine. That's how Daniel was pulled out of his hiding place and arrested. He was taken to a juvenile detention center where he waited 10 months for his trial.
May 1987, Daniel was released on bail. His trial for trespassing and armed assault was scheduled to take place in December 1987, but it didn't happen because the teenager had other plans. The stay in a juvenile detention center had no effect on the boy's character. When he was released on bail, he broke into his neighbor's house and stole firearms from him, 2 pistols. On the afternoon of December 1, 1987, Daniel LaPlante, armed with a pistol, broke into the home of the Gustafson family in Townsend. But this time, he decided not to play with the residents of the house, but to proceed in a more drastic way. The Gustafson family consisted of 4 people, but was expecting another baby in the near future. Living in the house were 30-year-old Priscilla, who was pregnant with her 3rd child, her 35-year-old husband Andrew, and 2 children, 7-year-old Abigail and 5-year-old William. Andrew was a lawyer and his wife was a middle school teacher. She sang in the church choir and was deeply devoted to her Christian faith. When Andrew came home from work that day around 7 o'clock, the rooms were dark and there was an ominous silence. He went up the stairs and entered the marital bedroom, where a horrific sight awaited him. There was blood everywhere. Priscilla was lying face down on the bed. Her head was covered with a pillow. The woman was dead. Fearing what he would see next, Andrew ran out of the house and called the police. He couldn't bear the thought that his children might have been killed in the same way. The police officers found the bodies of 5-year-old William and 7-year-old Abigail in separate bathrooms. They had been drowned. In the master bedroom, 2 .22 caliber shell casings, an open beer can, and semen stains were found on the bedding. Apparently, the woman had been shot with a pillow over her face and subsequently abused. Several items were missing from the apartment, including a cable television set-top box and a cordless phone. The alleged intruder had left shoe prints in the flower bed in front of the house. The whole town was shocked by the massacre at the Gustafson home. No one could understand who had committed such a heinous crime, who had laid hands on innocent children and a pregnant woman. The investigators had to compile a list of possible suspects. Daniel LaPlante was also on this list, as he had previously committed crimes against the Bowen family. When the officers came to question him, the boy was standing on the porch. As soon as he saw the police, he ran away and hid in the woods. Obviously, he had something to hide. When the investigators searched the house, they found several pieces of evidence linking Daniel to the crime. 2 .22 caliber shell casings were found in the Gustafsons' house, matching the 2 casings from the crime scene, and then the weapon itself, hidden in the glove compartment of an old car. In Daniel's wardrobe, there was a pair of sneakers that matched the footprints in the flower bed in front of the Gustafsons' house. Although DNA technology was still in its infancy at the time, a later laboratory analysis of Daniel's blood showed that he was a type A secretor. The semen stain on Priscilla's bed also belonged to a man who was a type A secretor. The police issued a search warrant, and the search for the suspect began. Several dozen officers, service dogs, and a police helicopter were deployed. During his escape, Danny got into a woman's car at gunpoint and forced her to drive him out of town. The driver managed to trick the man. She immediately called the police and provided the make and license plate of her car that Danny fled with. At that time, several other people had already reported to emergency services that they had seen Daniel. Thanks to the public's help, the authorities found the teenager on December 3, 2 days after the crime. He had hidden in a dumpster at a sawmill, about 18 kilometers from Townsend. At the time of his arrest, Daniel was laughing hysterically, which confused the police officers. They found a weapon on him that he had hidden in his underwear. He had no reason to take the lives of the Gustafsons. He broke into their house and at some point decided to kill everyone present, simply because he felt like it. If Tina Bowen hadn't jumped out of the window on the first floor and called the police from the neighbor's house, Daniel probably would have sent them to their graves too. He was later charged with the massacre of Priscilla, Abigail, and William Gustafson, in addition to the charges related to his crimes against the Bowen family. Daniel pled not guilty to all charges. His trial began in October 1988, when the boy turned 18 years old. He was to be tried as an adult. Although he was still a minor at the time of his criminal acts, psychiatric reports showed that he understood the consequences of his actions and was capable of standing trial. During the hearing, the defendant showed no remorse, but merely smiled to himself. Far from regretting the death of a pregnant woman and her 2 children, he seemed to find the whole thing amusing. Daniel LaPlante was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Over the years, he filed appeals, all of which were rejected. After the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles cannot be sentenced to life without parole, LaPlante found hope. In 2017, 47-year-old Daniel LaPlante appealed and asked for a sentence reduction. At the hearing to review the verdict, the convicted man apologized to the Gustafson family for the first time. He said he was sincerely sorry for what he had done and lacked the words to fully express his deep sorrow. However, those present felt that the apology was superficial and insincere. Danny was apparently only doing what they wanted him to say. He kept a stony face during the apology and did not even make eye contact with the relatives of the Gustafson family. The judge upheld LaPlante's sentence. His story of his crimes was widely covered in the media and in documentaries about real crimes. Today, at the age of 54, Daniel remains incarcerated in the Massachusetts Correctional Facility, where he will stay until at least 2032. Only after that can he be released on parole. Look closer. Perhaps a stranger is also living in your house, watching every move you make. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.
On an early September morning in the decade, shrill screams suddenly broke the silence in one of the quietest neighborhoods in Bristol. Neighbors immediately looked out their windows and saw a young man standing in the street wearing only his underwear. His skin looked as if it was covered in some kind of dirt. But when the neighbors went outside to help the strange man, it turned out that the dark substance was his skin. It was literally peeling off in shreds as he just stood there begging for help. Clearly, the young man was in unimaginable pain, and despite the efforts of his neighbors, there was little they could do to help him at that time. Luckily, there was no traffic jam in the city at the time, and the first ambulance was on the scene within minutes. The arriving paramedics were undoubtedly astonished by how severe and distressing the man's physical condition was. But this was only the beginning of this cruel case, which over time showed the horrific depths to which human cruelty can lead. In this video, I will tell you about the incredibly tragic case of Mark Van Dongen, a young and talented engineer whose life took the darkest turn shortly after he attempted to end his toxic relationship. Mark Van Dongen was a Dutch citizen. Mark's father, Kees Van Dongen, described him as an extremely empathetic person, always characterized by care, kindness, and compassion. Even as a little boy, Mark constantly showed empathy toward his peers and returned toys that he had won through fair play. He simply didn't want them to be upset. In college, Mark studied civil engineering. It is safe to say that he was one of the most successful students in his degree program. This was not surprising, as he had always been an ambitious young man. To put it simply, Mark wanted to be successful both in his studies and in his professional life. After completing his studies in the Netherlands, he moved to Bristol in the United Kingdom to continue his education and find a job in his field. Moving to another country was indeed the start of a new chapter in the young man's life. At that time, Mark met Berlina Wallace Kennan, a fashion student from South Africa who was nearly 20 years older than him. According to reports, Mark and Berlina started dating in 2010. In the beginning, their relationship looked promising. At least, they quickly became close and started living together. Without a doubt, Mark was very invested in their relationship, supporting Berlina both emotionally and financially. Over time, however, they had their first serious problems. To put it simply, Berlina began to show herself as an emotionally unstable and controlling woman with many complexes. As a result, their relationship began to worry Mark's friends and relatives. This was completely normal, as they often had to observe how Berlina manipulated his emotions and constantly had tantrums. Furthermore, they had seen visible signs of the woman's physical aggression on Mark's body, and had even learned that Berlina had once poured boiling water over him while he was sleeping. But despite these incidents, Mark somehow remained in a relationship with Berlina, and as far as I know, it lasted about 5 years. In August 2015, however, his patience had run out, and he decided to break up with the woman. Looking for something new, Mark met another woman named Violet Farquharson, and soon after they began a romantic relationship. Nevertheless, Berlina did not want to let Mark go. She literally flooded him with messages, trying to instill guilt in him and also threatening him with reprisals. However, he always tried to remain calm and did not respond to the threats against him. Additionally, Mark continued to support the woman financially even after they had officially broken up. But for some reason, that didn't suit her, and eventually her jealousy turned into obsession. In other words, Berlina began stalking Mark and harassing his new affair with silent phone calls. At that time, he often told his friends that he was afraid of Berlina, and it must be said that after her threats to harm herself, his fears only grew stronger. According to one of his closest friends, she even threatened to injure herself and then make it look like he had done it. At the same time, despite his fear, Mark felt somewhat obliged to visit Berlina regularly to ensure mutual well-being. In September 2015, Mark made another attempt to end the relationship once and for all and visited Berlina's apartment one last time. Shortly after he entered the apartment, the conversation devolved into an argument. The woman again refused to acknowledge that he had left her and clung to the relationship despite his regular attempts to end it. According to sources, Berlina told Mark that day that she would spend the night in a hotel. He, for his part, decided to stay overnight in her apartment for some reason. Around 3 a.m., when Mark was already asleep, Berlina returned home. Shortly thereafter, she went into the bedroom and woke Mark, saying, "If I can't have him, no one else will." And before he could react to those words, Berlina spat acid directly into his face. In a fraction of a second, the liquid struck Mark's skin. He literally screamed in pain and leaped out of bed in agony. Mark, who could barely see, went outside and shouted for help, waking most of the neighbors who immediately rushed to their windows. At first, they thought it was a prank or something similar. One of the neighbors even thought the commotion was caused by the howling of a fox that had wandered into the residential area. After a few minutes, however, it became clear what had actually happened. While waiting for the ambulance, the neighbors took Mark into the apartment and poured cold water over him to alleviate his suffering. But despite their efforts, his body had already sustained enormous damage. When the paramedics arrived on the scene, Mark was foaming at the mouth. Moreover, he was blinded and still in severe pain. There was no doubt among all specialists that the damage to Mark's body was simply catastrophic. His face and upper body were covered in deep burns, and the acid was still eating through his skin and muscle tissue. Despite his agony, Mark managed to report who had attacked him. He also asked the paramedics to check on his new girlfriend, as she might have also been attacked by Berlina. But that was not the case, because the attacker was still in the apartment, sitting calmly on the bed. She was likely completely unaffected by Mark's piercing screams echoing through the neighborhood. Instead of calling for help, Berlina simply grabbed the phone and called a close friend, showing no signs of remorse. Fortunately for Mark, the paramedics worked very quickly. They administered oxygen and painkillers to combat his breathing problems and somewhat stabilize his condition. While the young man was being transported to the hospital, the first police officers had already arrived at the scene. They quickly questioned the neighbors, who confirmed that he had identified Berlina as his attacker. These observations, combined with Mark's account to the doctors and neighbors, were finally reason enough to act swiftly. When police officers entered Berlina's apartment, she was still sitting on the bed, showing no visible signs of anxiety. And despite the chaos unfolding right outside her door, she remained unconcerned and did not even think of offering assistance to the man she had just attacked. Be that as it may, the officers noted her detached behavior and took her into custody on suspicion of grievous bodily harm. After the woman's arrest, investigations continued in her apartment to gather possible evidence and other information. The police managed to find a used acid bottle that no longer had the original label attached. This circumstance suggested that Berlina deliberately wanted to conceal the contents from the public. During the initial interrogation, the woman claimed she did not know that the bottle contained acid and not plain water. Meanwhile, doctors had already determined that the burns covered about 25% of Mark's body. At the same time, his left leg, which already showed signs of circulatory collapse, was a serious problem. It was clear to all specialists that they were dealing with a victim of one of the worst acid attacks they had ever experienced. And since the young man's condition was deteriorating relentlessly, he had to be transferred to the intensive care unit and placed in an induced coma. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation. They found that Berlina had been preparing the attack for weeks. Investigators also spoke with Mark's relatives, all of whom reported Berlina's emotionally unstable and manipulative behavior toward him. They specifically mentioned a series of events that occurred in the final months of their relationship, including the boiling water incident. Overall, Mark's relatives described their relationship as a growing escalation of physical aggression that culminated in this brutal attack. Furthermore, investigators collected compelling evidence that Berlina had sought therapists and admitted to them that she had serious issues with anger control. During her last visit with a therapist, Berlina reportedly stated that she gets an incredible adrenaline rush when someone disagrees with her. Sometime later, the fact that she had purchased acid became known. It turned out that the woman had simply ordered it on Amazon. After receiving a container of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid, Berlina deliberately removed the label which stated that the acid causes severe burns and other serious damage upon skin contact. Investigators believe the woman did this to prevent Mark or other people from discovering the colorless substance and recognizing it as sulfuric acid. It is also important that the examination of Berlina's electronic devices revealed that the choice of sulfuric acid itself was not random. In the weeks leading up to the actual attack, she conducted more than 80 search queries regarding various manufacturers of sulfuric acid. Furthermore, she visited dozens of online resources and read hundreds of reports about the physical damage and long-term effects on the human body suffered by victims of such attacks. There is no doubt that the volume of data from her research led to the conclusion that the attack was not impulsive. The fact that the woman did not make a single attempt to help the young man or call an ambulance is further evidence of this. At the same time, she harbored no doubt that the acid had worked, inflicting the worst possible injuries on Mark. As mentioned earlier, Berlina simply sat on her bed, feeling satisfied and showing complete indifference. And honestly, that is truly astonishing. How could one ignore the suffering of a person close to them who is literally writhing in pain? To return to Mark, after he was placed in an induced coma, he spent about 4 months in the intensive care unit. And when the young man woke up, the extent of his injuries was still clearly visible. As a result of neuropathy stemming from muscle mass loss, Mark was paralyzed from the neck down to his toes. Essentially, he could not move anything except his tongue. The acid had eaten so deeply into the lower part of his left leg that amputation was the only way to prevent further complications. Despite the specialists' efforts to save most of the limb, the damage was too great and the leg had to be removed up to the knee. Furthermore, the acid also burned Mark's face, leaving him partially blinded and severely disfigured. When the young man first saw his new reflection, he was literally devastated. And despite the support of his father, his friends, and the medical staff, Mark understandably had emotional difficulty accepting reality. It is also important to mention that at that time, he communicated only with the help of a letterboard, pointing to the correct letters with his tongue. While this was a truly grueling process, it was the only way to express his thoughts. In any case, the loss of his former way of life, coupled with the constant and relentless physical pain, plunged Mark into the deepest depression of his life. Of course, credit must be given to his father, who tried to be there for him as often as possible and ensure he stayed in good spirits. In November 2016, the young man was transferred to a boarding facility in the city of Gloucester. However, the conditions there were deplorable. Mark's father had to drive around 1,300 kilometers to visit his son and often found him lying in his own feces. This was undoubtedly a heartbreaking sight, and so he resolved to get him out of there at any cost. Later, Mark was indeed moved to another boarding facility in Belgium, but his suffering continued there as well. Of course, the medical staff tried their best to improve the young man's living conditions, but they simply did not have the experience or equipment to treat and care for people with injuries as severe as Mark's. And despite all the progress he made, such as being able to whisper, the young man still questioned the meaning of such a life.
Sometime later, Mark's condition worsened again because he had developed a severe lung infection. It required a tracheotomy, a common surgical procedure where the windpipe is cut open so the patient can breathe normally. Of course, this operation could save Mark's life, but it would also take away his ability to whisper. And that was a small but crucial impetus for his ability to communicate with his father. Ultimately, it was something like a final blow for Mark. Given the paralysis, the unbearable pain, and the silence, he told his father that he no longer wanted to fight for his life. With the support of his family members, Mark applied to the Belgian government for what is known as voluntary euthanasia, which was approved under certain conditions. His application was reviewed by 3 different authorities, and all confirmed that he was enduring unbearable suffering. Thus, Mark spent the final minutes of his life on January 2, 2017, together with his father, whom he had personally asked to stay with him until the end. The trial against Berlina Wallace did not begin until April 2018, almost 3 years after her attack. By this time, the woman had still not pleaded guilty and continued to insist that she did not know she was pouring acid on Mark. However, upon closer inspection of the case, her story immediately collapsed. The prosecution presented extremely compelling evidence that her attack was malicious and carefully planned. For example, they detailed the moment Berlina purchased the bottle of concentrated sulfuric acid, as well as the deliberate removal of the label. Furthermore, they stated that the woman had repeatedly searched for information about sulfuric acid attacks. In their opinion, Berlina not only wanted to harm Mark, but also to ensure that no woman would ever want to be with him again. Numerous witnesses also described Berlina's controlling and aggressive behavior, painting an overall picture of their toxic relationship. Above all, the prosecution argued that the woman's actions were the direct cause of the young man's death. Therefore, a murder charge was presented to the jury. However, since Mark's life had been ended by voluntary euthanasia, the jury had to decide whether Berlina's actions were the primary cause of his death or whether other factors contributed. To general surprise, the jury could not determine that the woman's actions met the requirements of murder law. In other words, they did not find her guilty of committing either simple murder or manslaughter. However, they did find her guilty of the deliberate use of a corrosive substance with the intent to cause grievous bodily harm, a serious charge that also carried a high penalty. During the sentencing, the judge delivered a rather poignant speech that highlighted the recklessness of Berlina's act and the immense pain she inflicted on Mark and his family. Here is the approximate content of the speech. On September 2nd, 2015, you purchased 1 liter of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. You intended to attack Mark Van Dongen with it because you wanted him to leave another woman for you. Previously, you removed the label, stating that the acid causes severe burns and other serious injuries. You did this to prevent the acid from being found in your apartment. You chose the timing of the attack in advance. It came when Mark Van Dongen was sleeping in the bed you once shared with him in your apartment, wearing only his underwear. Because he was asleep, vulnerable, and virtually naked, he had no real way to escape your attack and protect his face and body. The burns Mark suffered covered 2/3 of his face and most of the top of his chest, as well as his arms and thighs. They affected about 25% of his body surface area. The subsequent skin graft and the one following that covered over 4% of Mark's total body surface area. The treating burn surgeon said he had never had a patient with such severe injuries caused by a sulfuric acid attack. In total, Mark spent about 11 months in the intensive care unit. During this time, he had to undergo numerous surgical procedures. His left leg had to be amputated. He completely lost vision in his left eye and almost completely lost it in his right eye. Doctors used the strongest painkillers, which in turn caused severe side effects and complications. Mark was unable to communicate for 4 months. He suffered not only severe burns, but also damage to a number of vital bodily systems.
During his time in the intensive care unit, he suffered from recurring chest infections and septic shock. Mark's kidneys were damaged. He had severe bowel problems. His heart rate and liver function were also impaired. When he was discharged from the hospital in November 2016, he was paralyzed from the neck down to his toes. His upper arms and legs were immobile. Had Mark chosen to continue fighting, he would have required further surgery and meticulous care. Mark's other treating doctor said that his appearance could not be restored. This meant that he was permanently and irrevocably disfigured. The scarring on his face was classified as the most severe. In view of all these circumstances, Berlina Wallace was sentenced to 12 years in prison. This verdict naturally triggered mixed reactions in society. Many people, including Mark's family members, felt that this sentence was not harsh enough given the extent of his suffering. The case also sparked a loud public debate about the possibility of using sulfuric acid as a weapon. This led to an upcoming discussion about stricter regulations for the sale of such substances and higher penalties for offenses related to them. Subsequently, the increased attention to the case also contributed to the adoption of new legislation regarding so-called offensive weapons. Thanks to this law, new age restrictions were introduced for the purchase of corrosive substances. At the same time, many retailers destroyed their internal guidelines to limit the sale of dangerous chemicals in this manner. Following the verdict, Mark Van Dongen's family members struggled with their grief for a long time. As far as I know, the young man's younger brother set up a special crowdfunding page to raise money and support his father, whose previous financial stability had suffered. On the page, the young man described how his father traveled to and from Bristol for months, sleeping in his car in the hospital parking lot to save money. He also spoke of Mark's unbearable suffering,
such as paralysis, the loss of a leg, an eye, and an ear, and how the constant pain drove him mad. As for Berlina Wallace, she immediately began serving her sentence in a British prison. Unfortunately, due to internal confidentiality rules related to the law regarding the placement of prisoners, no exact information was disclosed about which prison she was sent to. I can only say that she will be eligible for parole for the first time in 2027. However, the decision regarding Berlina's future fate will depend on her behavior and other not insignificant factors assessed by a special parole board. In his public statements, Mark's father, Kees van Dongen, expressed his hope that she would have to fight for this decision in her favor. Overall, the statement reflected the conviction of Mark's family that Berlina's actions deserved a harsher punishment. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.